Hi students, this week we're talking about colonial America. That basically means the period from 1700 until the time of the American Revolution, or until the years leading up to the American Revolution. So we're looking at the period from about 1700 to 1750 or 1770. We're looking at the ways in which American society is developing over that period. And so one aspect that I want to draw your attention to in particular is the growth of the population in the English colonies in North America during this period. Around 1700, you have about a population of about 250,000 in these colonies. But by the time you get to 1750, that's grown to 1 million inhabitants. And by the time you get to 1775, that's grown to 2 million inhabitants. So the population of the North American English colonies is growing extremely rapidly. And this is part of the reason why these colonies are going to be in a position of power to exercise a growing influence over the rest of the continent. And it is part of the reason why you see the development of American culture during this period. Part of the reason why the English colonies in North America are growing so quickly is because of the presence of women in this society. Remember that I said in the past, one aspect of English colonial society, English colonial model that was different from the Spanish and the French colonial models was that English colonists came to North America in family groups. And so this means you have a greater concentration of women. It means, therefore, that the population is going to grow much more quickly. And so women play an important role in the development of colonial America. We see that they are at the heart of the textile industry. They are providing all the clothes for settlers and colonists during this period. There's a high infant mortality rate. There's a high rate of women who die during childbirth, but both of these numbers are still better than in Europe at the time. And part of that is because there is more land that's available. Land is more plentiful, land is cheaper, and this means that colonists are getting married earlier. It means that they're having more children. It means that they themselves are healthier and their children are healthier, and this enables the population to grow. So the opportunity of plentiful land, relatively large population of women means that the population in English colonies in North America is growing very rapidly during the 18th century. How are the societies different in the different types of English colonies? So we're just going to go over these very briefly. First, we'll talk about the South. In the southern colonies, we find the development of some very large plantations. So a very small part of this society, the plantation owners, become the owners of very large estates. They become very wealthy through the production of rice, tobacco, indigo, which is used for dyeing clothes, and sugar. And so these become the wealthiest people in English colonial America. Remember that I said that these colonies had some form of representation, but that there were pretty stringent qualifications. In Virginia, just to give you an example, you had to own 100 acres of land to qualify as a citizen with full rights to vote for the House of Burgesses, which was the name of the Virginia Representative Assembly. And so only 40% of the population actually had those rights. So this is very much a hierarchical society. It's also a society where this very wealthy class in this society, this very wealthy highest class in this society, is very dependent on the labor of African slaves. And this is a change that we start to see take place towards the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century. That slave labor becomes more and more important to the economy of the South. Initially, African slaves were treated basically the same as indentured servants. Their period of slavery was limited, and if they worked through that, if they survived, they would become free. And so you have a class of land-owning African Americans that develops in the first half of the 17th century. But this starts to change in the second half of the 17th century, partly because fewer immigrants are coming to the American colonies. That means there's a decline in the amount of indentured labor, and so you start to see the development of racialized slavery. And this begins during the 1660s. There is a growing move on the part of these colonies to establish that anyone who is African American or Native American and who is a slave will remain a slave for the rest of their life. This is something new, this is something different. This is the point at which slavery starts to become more important to the economies of these colonies, and it's also the point at which it becomes racialized, that being a slave is associated with being a member of a particular race. This was also something that was new in the second half of the 17th century and into the 18th century. And in the 18th century, especially in the second half after 1750, we see the number of slaves in the South grow rapidly, grow from 250,000 in 1750, about 250,000, to about 400,000 in 1770. So in just 20 years, almost a 50% increase in the number of slaves. So slavery is becoming a more and more central part of American society, especially in the southern colonies. Okay, so that's the South. We'll look at the other two colonies. So we have the New England colonies. New England colonies are kind of based on smaller segments of society. It's a kind of a more rural model. And a lot of the time it's based around the creation of a church. You have the creation of a church and a mission church. Families kind of take up their residences around the church. And eventually this society would petition to be granted the rights of a township and would become a town. And in these towns you have the small houses where families live. New England, with its longer, harsher winters, with its rocky ground, it's not a great place to establish large plantations, large crops of tobacco and sugar like we see in the South. Instead, we see most of the farming that's being done in New England is subsistence farming. It's the farming that's necessary for families to survive. The real source of wealth in this society, or this area of American society, is on the sea, through fishing and through whaling. Lastly, we come to the middle colonies, the Dutch colonies of New Jersey and Pennsylvania and New York that were taken over by the English. And these colonies are going to remain multi-ethnic. They're going to remain multi-ethnic, mixture of Dutch and German and Scottish and Irish and English immigrants, partly because the most wealthy members of this society are less wealthy than the plantation owners that we talked about in the South. They actually don't have the money to purchase slaves. And so instead they're going to purchase indentured servants, which is cheaper. And these indentured servants are going to work on their farms, but a percentage of them, of course, are going to survive their servitude and they're going to become free. And so once these populations become free, we start to see them spreading deeper into the interior. So the middle colonies are where we see the territory that we would call America expanding during this period. So Pennsylvania is pushing further and further west. And the farming that is done in the middle colonies is typically grain farming, barley, wheat. And so these middle colonies become the source of much of the food of the North American colonies. And we even see that this food is being shipped to slave plantations in the South and in the Caribbean, and is being used to provide food supplies there, as well as to more densely populated areas in New England. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in the next video.